My guest this hour is Robert Spencer, founder and president of Jihad Watch. He took a shift a little bit in this last book titled Rating American Presidents. So this hour is going to be a bit different. I've recorded some other interviews before, but never played one that I did that was as timely, but recorded so much earlier. We did it a few weeks ago, and I figured I would wait until the week of inauguration. You know, that would be cool. With transferring power, why not talk about presidents? And little did we know what the last few weeks would be like. So that's going to make this conversation a little interesting. But give us a call at 312-642-5600 if you want to chime in on presidential rankings. So here is the first part of that interview.
Robert Spencer, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Great to be here.
So what made you, the director of Jihad Watch and the leading writer on radical Islam, write a book about rating presidents?
Well, I'll tell you, Charles, the interest that I've had in this goes back to when I was a little kid, but it seems to have become a lot more urgent recently with the left's war on history and attempt to make us ashamed of being American and not willing to defend America as a result. And I thought there needs to be some pushback. We need to remember what was great about America, what can be great and should be great about America again, who the heroes were and what made them heroic, and also who the people who were less than heroic were and why.
And I'm sure there's plenty of those. You know, I got to understand, where you're going with this, but since the listeners may or may not, I would like to ask you to tell the listeners how the presidents are currently rated and why they're rated that way.
Well, most of the time when they're rated nowadays, I looked at all these, all kinds of ratings and surveys when I was getting this book together. Most of the time, they're all leftist historians who rate the presidents highly if they disrespect the Constitution, if they are big government, high tax internationalists who put America last, essentially. And they put the presidents who put America first at the bottom of their ratings. So I just actually turned that around and judged the presidents on the basis of, were they good for America and Americans? Were Americans safer, stronger, more prosperous at the end of their administration than they were at the beginning? That was my primary criterion, and it was on that basis that I evaluated all 45.
I have not read the book yet, but I will. But I can sense that I agree with you because of the premise of as why you say how you describe the way they rate currently. I actually view the current rating system the same way I do the Nobel Peace Prize. The moment they gave Obama, or for that matter, Yasser Arafat the award,
oh yeah,
it's lost its meaning, right? So it's almost like, you used to kill people. You stopped killing people, so that makes you great. It's crazy, or you did nothing. So I look at that the same way. I say the same can be said about rating Woodrow Wilson so high. I mean, authoritarian, check. Racist, check. Socialist, check. Weak on foreign policy, check. Let's make him number 3. I mean, it's absolutely crazy. So now I guess the new woke movement's kind of hurting because they're removing his name from things. But why do you think it took so long for people to notice the bad things about Woodrow Wilson? Because they're so obvious.
Well, the thing is, the rules really only apply to conservatives. And so when they say it's terrible to be racist, they really only mean it's terrible for people who like to be racist. They don't mean that if you're a leftist, socialist, internationalist, that it's bad. Now, if you don't believe me, or you think I'm exaggerating, just think about the governor of Virginia right now, who appeared in blackface, standing next to a guy in a Klan robe, or maybe he was the one wearing the Klan robe. We can't tell now. But either way, if he had been a conservative, he would not be governor of Virginia today. But the rules just don't apply to the left. And so it's the same thing with Woodrow Wilson. They've had a hard time canceling Woodrow. They didn't want to do it because he is the model for all the presidents that come after him, all the worst of the presidents that come after him, in putting America last and being internationalist and socialist, trampling upon the Constitution and so on. And also he is responsible to a tremendous degree for the poor state of race relations and the fact that people like Obama were able to exploit it, because the federal government was integrated in the 1870s by President Ulysses S. Grant, and Woodrow Wilson resegregated it and brought all that back when it was on its way out.
Well, I'm sure you went through all 45, so you can dig out some nuggets and you'll teach me and the listeners some things. But like I said, I have a better than average understanding of most of these presidents, so I would probably throw some things out there. I should be talking about the books, but I had to start with Wilson because I wouldn't put him number 45, but he is my least favorite of them. He's the one I like the least. He's close to the bottom, but I mean, I just, think that man was so terrible that I had to, kind of point him out. And it's funny you mentioned Grant. I will mention some things about Grant too. But before I get to that, I want to know the last thing about your rating. So how do you account for intangibles? How do you account for, a president who may or may not have been great, but they didn't really have a major crisis to deal with that would have given them the opportunity to be great, or those who did a good job of engaging the public as opposed to those who kind of ignored them, personalities and that thing. How did you account for that?
In terms of personalities, I had to disregard that.
Okay.
Because I don't care if the president is a nice guy or not. A lot of people are hung on Trump and about his personality, and they say, what an ambitious braggart and a dope and all these things. Okay, maybe he is. I don't care, because he's not having dinner with me tonight. Not that I would turn him away if he wanted to drop by, but the fact is that what matters when we are talking about the presidents is what they do for our lives and what they do for the country. And that doesn't have anything to do with their personalities. Now, if their personalities intrude on how they make policy, then they do matter. Like Jimmy Carter was a very weak personality, and he weakened America on the global stage. And so maybe there's a connection there. But for the most part, I did not deal with what kind of people they were like. I was just interested in what they did as president. And as far as, what was the first one that you said?
Whether they had a crisis that gave them an opportunity to be great and all these other things that they'll say, well, if that person had to deal with that thing, they try to factor in all those things as well.
It's hard to account for that. And so I just based the evaluations on what they did as president. For example, most people would say, even today, that John Quincy Adams was a great statesman, one of the great early presidents, but he was not a great president. As a matter of fact, he was a completely ineffective and failed president. There were no great crises while he was president, but he wasn't able to put through anything of his program. Now, that does not diminish all the other things he did as an ambassador, as Secretary of State. He formulated the Monroe Doctrine, all these things that he did when he was not president. So he was a great man, but he doesn't get a high rating. It's just like Jefferson also was a great man who did great things, but as president, he wasn't as great, and he does not rate in my top tier.
All right, so let's talk about the big winners and losers. Who do you have high up on the new Mount Rushmore, the Robert Spencer Mount Rushmore?
Yeah, it's funny because I do have 4 people on that.
Wow.
So, this is my own personal Mount Rushmore, and I wrote the book last year, but I stand by this now, even though this has been quite a tumultuous year. Washington and Lincoln stay there, but then Coolidge and Donald Trump are the other 2.
Ooh, I was close. I thought that you would. Yeah, I was close. I think I got 3 of the 4. Wow. So you said Washington, Lincoln, Coolidge, and Trump.
Yes, sir.
Wow, that's going to drastically limit your interview request. No, but okay. So let me see. Washington is kind of a given. I think I'm going to do cool. I know why, but to some people who may not be right-leaning, why Coolidge and why Trump?
Both of them actually for reasons. They came in after big government internationalists, statists, and they rolled back regulations, they cut taxes, they got the economy moving, they strengthened position on the global stage, they made for a period of prosperity and peace, even while they're being made fun of as somebody who was not equipped for the job. They turned the conventional wisdom on its head and showed that the experts didn't know as much as they claimed to know.
Well, he stands by that. I guess we'll see what happens after those last couple of weeks. We'll talk more with Robert Spencer on the other side, president of Jihad Watch, about presidential ranking. Give us a call at 312-642-5600. You're listening to The Charles Love Show on AM 560, The Answer.
Kind of overdid it in Denver, and I just can't remember her name.
Now, more of The Charles Love Show on AM 560, The Answer, with your host, Charles Love.
Welcome back. I am playing my interview with Robert Spencer, founder and president of Jihad Watch, and we're discussing his book, Rating American Presidents. Give us a call at 312-642-5600 and tell us how you rate the presidents. We ended the last segment with Robert giving us his personal Mount Rushmore. And I'm sure there'll be shock amongst people surprised that he put Trump there. And he said he stands by it, and he wrote the book a year ago, and we'll just have to have him back and see if the recent events changed his mind. Another takeaway from that segment about me is that it's obvious that I hate Woodrow Wilson. But I like these conversations because I think people get emotional and they get so extreme. And you hear today, obviously, people saying for the last 3 or 4 years, Trump is the worst president ever. Or, even when Obama was president, conservatives said Obama. I was like, you cannot like him, but ever is extreme. Either you're being emotional or you don't really understand history, because there were some really, really bad presidents. So I think this is interesting to kind of go into some detail and talk about how we actually rate the presidents. And here's the second part of the interview.
Okay. So that's your 4. I may come back to 1 or 2 of those, but I have to ask who didn't make the Mount Rushmore, but people will be surprised by who you ranked so high.
There probably would be the most surprise about people like Grant that we mentioned before,
which is shocking. I think Grant should be up there, but go on.
Yeah, but most people say he was a failure as president. I say he was a great president, one of the greatest in the second group that I have, along with Warren G. Harding is the other big surprise.
Now, that would definitely surprise people.
Yeah, most people don't know anything about him at all. It was just
the scandal. The Teapot-Dome.
He had a girlfriend, and those things, as far as the moral issue goes, after Bill Clinton, it's hard to say that is a make or break proposition. But also here again, that's not something that affected his ability as president. And so what we need to do is look at his presidency, and then he is the one who follows Wilson, gets the prosperity of the 1920s going, turns the economy around, cuts back regulations, cuts back on some measures that Wilson had put in that actually destroyed the freedom of speech. He had people in prison just for opposing World War I, not for any actual crime. And so Harding once again restored respect for the First Amendment and observance of the First Amendment.
So now let's talk bottom. So who are your bottom feeders? Do you have 4 of those too, or?
Unfortunately, I got more of those.
17. Unfortunately, I got 17 of those.
No, there are 6, I believe, who have 0 out of 10. I have a rating of 1 to 10, and there are 6 who actually don't even get 1. I had to give them 0 because there wasn't anything good you could say about their presidency. And that was James Buchanan, who was the president right before the Civil War, and then Wilson that we talked about, Herbert Hoover, Jimmy Carter, Bill Clinton, Barack Obama. How many is that? I think I left one out, but you get
wow. So I knew Buchanan would be down there. I was going to ask how you dealt with the people who you kind of had to throw out because they had days, your Harrison and your William Henry Harrison and your Zachary Taylors and your Garfields. You put Obama below Harrison. That's shocking. The man had 31 days.
Yeah, well, Harrison, I didn't actually rate. He's the only one I didn't rate because nothing happened. He was president for 30 days and he was sick for most of it.
That's true.
So you can't really give him any kind of rating at all. But I do talk about how he was elected. What's interesting about Harrison is the election of 1840 and how it set the pattern for how the presidential elections have been conducted since then. But yeah, Obama does get a 0. He does militarily, politically, and economically. And so for that, you can't give him any credit.
I had a question here. You kind of threw me back. I figured most of the heavy shift were going to be, that middle of the road from the founding to, Kennedy and, that kind of thing. So I was like, well, it's kind of new. So how would you do the last, 3 presidents? But, you already got Trump on the Mount Rushmore. You got Obama down below. So you put them in there. Because I was going to say, well, I guess I can still ask some questions. So it's still rather fresh. So over time, how do you think people will view them 10 years out? Because especially the Trump thing is just so fresh. I think, obviously, as conservatives, if you're a conservative, you're going to rate Trump better. But I think that it's going to take longer for him because it's so polarizing. But I think when people look at his record across the board, they're going to rate him better down the road.
Yes. It's just a matter of whether the people doing the rating are the socialist internationalists or whether they're people who put America first. And that's the real question. When it comes to Trump, when it comes to Obama, it's the same thing. If the socialist internationalists win out and America, as we know it, is destroyed, then they're going to rate Trump very low. But if America prevails as a free society, then Trump's going to rate very high. And Obama, just the opposite in both cases.
So let me ask you this. I won't ask necessarily the ratings of the others, but I do want to highlight a couple of the other presidents and just get an idea of how you rated them in general, like what your feelings of them are. So let's start with the big one, Teddy Roosevelt.
He actually doesn't rate as high as I wanted to. You asked about personalities before, and he's really one. He's such an appealing personality, such an attractive figure, right, that I wanted to rate him high. And of course, he's on Mount Rushmore. But there was one big thing that I had to lower his rating for. He gets a 4 out of 10, and that's not really very high. Mm-hmm. And one of the main reasons is because of the coal strike. There was a major strike at the coal companies at a time when America depended upon coal for heat 100%. Mm-hmm. And so winter was coming, and it looked as if a lot of people, especially in the northern states, were going to have a very, very, very difficult winter without being able to get coal. And so Theodore Roosevelt threatened to send troops to open up the coal mines by force. And somebody said to him, you can't do that. That's unconstitutional. You can't interfere with private businesses like that. And Theodore Roosevelt said, to hell with the Constitution when the people need coal. And I think, well, that sounds great in a certain sense. He was a man of action. He didn't let himself get caught up in the details. But I like the Constitution. I want the Constitution to stay there. I don't want people to say, let's throw out the Constitution to solve this problem that we got. I mean, that's the problem that we have now. The COVID hit just as I was finishing up the book, and there's just a little bit of mention of it at the end. But the idea that our civil rights can be entirely thrown out the window because of this disease, the Constitution doesn't say that we have the right to free speech and the right to bear arms and the right of these very rights, unless there's the pandemic. And Theodore Roosevelt set the pattern, that kind of thinking, when he said, to hell with the Constitution when the people need coal.
Yeah, I think that you're right about the current thing, not even just currently because of COVID. I think if you go back to the beginning of our conversation, you talk about why certain presidents are rated where they are and why. It's because, even if we use your measuring stick of defending the Constitution and giving people focusing on their freedoms, it's because many people, and more today than before, are willing to say, I don't care whether this meets the criteria of legalities from responsibilities of the federal government, as long as you're doing it for the right reasons. But the problem with that is always who gets to dictate what the right reasons are. Exactly.
And that's the big problem, that people don't know, they don't appreciate the importance of having the Constitution and having rights. We have been medicated and diseducated and propagandized for so many decades now by these socialist internationalists that people think it doesn't matter if we have these rights. What we need is for the government to protect us and take care of us. And that's the fault of people like Woodrow Wilson and Franklin Delano Roosevelt and Lyndon Johnson and the other big government presidents.
So I want to make a couple quick points. At the beginning of that, when he talked about the people that many would be surprised by the high rating, he talked about Harding more than Grant, but I think Grant's important too, because people forget that, until the people after him shifted gears, he was the president during all of the most of Reconstruction. His whole term fell in Reconstruction. He decimated the Klan. He did a lot of things. He bailed us out economically, even though we were so broke after the Civil War. So people gloss over him. It'll be interesting to see what happens with Trump over time. Like he said, it's true. It will be dictated by who writes history. And last, he talked about Teddy, but what about the people saying to hell with the Constitution when the people need coal? Coming up, more on presidents with Robert Spencer. You're listening to the Charles Love Show on AM 560, The Answer.
Now, more of the Charles Love Show on AM 560, The Answer, with your host, Charles Love.
Welcome back to the show. We are discussing presidential ratings with Robert Spencer, founder and president of Jihad Watch and author of Rating American Presidents. Before I go to the next clip, I want to say something quickly about two things he mentioned in the last segment. First, his bottom. I'm getting some replies and some shock by some of the presidents, not, like Buchanan, but Obama and some of the others, and not saying that my rating would be the same as his rating, or I agree with it. In fact, it would not be. But you got to keep in mind his context, that he is basing it solely on how closely the presidents operated to the Constitution. So it's not necessarily saying that they are the worst or the best because I liked what they did. It's just sticking with the Constitution. And we have to remember a lot of the things that we like, as I talked about before, to hell with the Constitution when the people need coal. A lot of people focus on what they like, not whether it was constitutional or not. I did when I was covering the Liberty Hour, I did a episode about presidential power and executive order and talked about a lot of the things that people celebrate today, Emancipation Proclamation and others that were executive orders. So if you're basing it on the Constitution, you might say, hey, you can't do that. And then Teddy Roosevelt. Teddy Roosevelt's interesting because he was the first celebrity president. You got to think about the first presidents were mostly elite. They wanted Washington to be a king, and they were the founding fathers. Then we went through the war hero phase. Teddy was, the first celebrity. He was the tough on crime former New York police commissioner. He was a military guy. He had, this gravitas and he had the right amount of crazy. So he was an interesting figure. And I go on here asking him about other interesting figures. So in this segment, we talk about FDR.
Well, since you went there, I guess we go there next. FDR.
Yeah, I gave him a 1. I was all set to give him a 0, but I had to give him a 1 point because he was an inspirational leader during World War II. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, during World War II, he made 3 major mistakes that made it a lot worse than it needed to have been. One was at the beginning of the war, there was every indication that Japan was going to attack sooner or later. I am not saying that he knew that Pearl Harbor was going to happen. I didn't find any evidence of that, but I did find plenty of evidence that he was warned that the Japanese were quite belligerent and that an attack was imminent. And yet he left our Pacific Fleet out there at Pearl Harbor completely vulnerable, when he could have taken some very easy steps to protect it that would have made the attack much less serious than it ended up being. And some people think it's because he wanted the American people, who were very much against getting into the war, to turn around and be in favor of the war. So he wanted the casualties, which if it's true, that would be abominable. He was evil, even evil or careless to a tremendous degree. Then in the middle of the war, he called for unconditional surrender of Germany. Now, Nazis were one of the most evil, if not the most evil, regime that the world has ever seen. But there were in the German high command some generals who wanted to overthrow Hitler. But when he said that we are going to have an unconditional surrender or nothing, then they didn't have any reason to do it, because they were thinking, we will get rid of Hitler and make a negotiated settlement with the Allies.
Country. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. When the Allies said, nope, there's not going to be any negotiated settlement, then they didn't have any reason to go ahead. All the wind went out of the sails of the opposition to Hitler. Then at the end of the war, when he was very sick, and how sick he was hidden from the American people, he flew halfway around the world to Yalta in the Crimea to hand control of Eastern Europe to Stalin. Now, the war had started in 1939 before America got in to protect Poland from domination by the Nazis. And at the end of the war, he hands over Poland to domination by the Soviets. So you can't really give him good high points for his conduct of the war. And then as far as the Depression goes, all his high taxes, big government programs, they just prolonged the Depression instead of allowing market forces to bring it to an end.
And that's not even talking about confiscating gold and interning Japanese Americans.
That's right. And so you add all that, and it just gets even worse. So really, I had to give him 1 point because he was so beloved by Americans, and they looked to him for inspiration during the war. And so you got to grant him that, but that's the only thing. Otherwise, he ranks down there with the worst.
You know, that's, again, the best example. I know I talked earlier about Obama, but that's probably the best example of the different rating scale here changing things, because if he's rating on a Constitution, there's half the country loved the New Deal and half the country think it's bad, you know, even as we look back in hindsight. But here he's questioning whether it was constitutional. You know, because I talked about confiscating gold and the other things, but here's another one for you. They came back up in the news. He tried to pack the courts as well. And even Democrats at the time were against it. We don't have those same Democrats now. Coming up, more with Robert Spencer. You're listening to The Charles Love Show on AM 560, The Answer.
The Charles Love Show continues on AM 560, The Answer. Here's Charles Love.
Welcome back to the show. We are discussing the presidents with Robert Spencer, founder and president of Jihad Watch. And next we discuss Andrew Jackson and the lesser-known John Tyler.
Andrew Jackson, I actually rated pretty highly. Now, that's very controversial nowadays because Jackson, of course, is given the blame for the Trail of Tears, the removal of the American Indians, the Cherokees in particular, to Oklahoma from the Southeast and from the central United States at that time. And the thing about it is that people like to portray, even Dinesh D'Souza has said Jackson is like Adolf Hitler, and they try to portray him as some genocidal maniac. That's wildly unfair and historically inaccurate. Jackson did not want to kill all the Indians. Jackson actually explained when he was justifying this program of relocation of the Indians that there were all these Indians who did not want to become Americans. And so there was either going to be constant war between the Americans and the Indians, or they were going to live separate from one another and not bother each other. Now, of course, that didn't work out either. But the idea that Jackson wanted them to all be killed is completely false. And actually, he had completely humanitarian reasons for wanting to relocate them. We might not agree nowadays that that was the best solution. But he was saying, look, we've made efforts to make them American. They don't want to be American. And so what else can we do? Now, certainly on the Trail of Tears, thousands of people died because there were no provisions for them on the way. And Jackson bears responsibility for that. There's no doubt. But this was not something that he actively tried to bring about. And one of the main things I rate Jackson highly for is for destroying the Bank of the United States, which was the first deep state in a certain sense. the first shadowy, unelected group of oligarchs who control the American government without being accountable to the voters. And Jackson killed the bank, and we staved off that problem for a while. But obviously, back now.
You know, not to mention his problems with his first run. And
that's another thing that's also kind of newsworthy nowadays, because 1824 is also an election that has been compared to 2020 in that Jackson won the election, but John Quincy Adams ended up being president because none of the candidates won a majority. So it's a little different from 2020 when Joe Biden has claimed to have won a majority, but he actually seems to have cheated to get there.
I think I want to mention one last one that I think very few people talk about. It's pivotal because of some of the first and the end of his presidency. John Tyler.
Yeah, he's a very interesting character. He's the only president to be expelled from his party while he was president. And one of the noteworthy things about that is that it's kind of a resonance with Trump also, because Trump, of course, is hated by George W. Bush and Mitt Romney, the establishment Republicans. He's really a new thing. And Tyler was also not really a member of the Whig Party. He was elected as vice president from the Whig Party. He became president when Harrison died. But he was not down the line with their program, and they actually kicked him out of the party over the same thing that I was just crediting Jackson for, killing the Bank of the United States. Right. They tried to revive it while Tyler was president, and they thought he would go ahead with it because the Whigs were in favor of the bank. But he did not believe the bank was a good idea, and he vetoed it twice, earning the everlasting hatred of his own party. But he did the right thing here again, because the bank was a group of unelected, unaccountable officials, private citizens who held extraordinary control over the U.S. government. They would just buy officials, just like nowadays. They would buy officials but with bribes, loans, to get them to do what they wanted. And so Tyler, once again, for the second time after Jackson did it, killed the bank.
Yeah, I think that he's interesting. Obviously, I don't think he was a good president overall, obviously. But that's just so, I mean, you have to look at people in their time. So I got a very, very small soft spot for him because no president had ever died before. So everybody was like, you know, that's why what do they call him? The accidental president. Because people were like, well, I know we claim we got a VP, but we don't really have to take this guy seriously, right? Can't we just? So he had to put his foot down. I was like, no, I'm the president, you know, step back. So that's one. And like you say, going against his own party for what he thinks is right. So a lot of times, you know, when people say, well, would I have done that or do I think it's right? It's the fact that, you know, you have to give them some credit for saying, I think it's wrong. So I really don't care that you all think you got a puppet in here. I'm not going for that. But then there's the ugliness, just the historical piece that most people don't know is how he ended, where he's buried and that kind of thing. You know, because people talk about the Confederacy and they talk about Lincoln because of the war. They talk about Jefferson Davis and all the figures from that, but very few people know that, you know, he sided strongly with the Confederacy. And because of that, he pretty much died and was buried with no distinctions.
Yeah. Well, actually, he was the only president buried under a foreign flag. Yeah. And so you can't give him any credit for that. But I'm only evaluating their presidency. So It's a terrible thing that Tyler joined the Confederacy and actually was elected to the Confederate Senate before he died. Mm-hmm. But that's not part of his presidency. And so it doesn't come into my evaluations. The other thing, though, that what you mentioned about him becoming president when Harrison died and putting his foot down, that's very important because a lot of people said, well, you're just a temporary president and we want to have another election. Mm-hmm. And he said, no, I'm going to serve out this term. There's not going to be another election until the next election time comes around in 1844. Now, that's very important because if he had said, yes, we'll have another election, it would have set the precedent that all you have to do to get a new election if you don't like the one we got is kill the president. And so he ruled that out as a possibility.
Coming up, the final segment with Robert Spencer. You're listening to The Charles Love Show.
The Charles Love Show continues on AM 560, The Answer. Here's Charles Love.
Welcome back. We're discussing presidential ratings with Robert Spencer, founder and president of Jihad Watch and author of Rating American Presidents. Here we have our final clip where I ask about the power of the presidency.
So we talk about whether things will change as far as the presidency. One of the things that I noticed, I've always talked about, because I'm a lover of the Constitution and liberty, and I felt that it's not a knock on President Trump or any other specific president. I just think that we have been going far too long with this. As long as our guy does what we want, then it's okay to circumvent the Constitution. And the problem with that is, one, it's not constitutional, but beyond that is they never cede power. So the next guy holds on to that power, he doesn't give it back, and he grows it. And if he's in the other party, now we're mad. So I'm wondering, I used to think this way and feel better about it because people were so upset, but because the media has skewed things, I don't know if it'll hold. It'd be interesting to hear your thoughts. I think that people were so upset with Trump and they kept screaming out the fascist silliness, even though they were wrong and didn't understand what fascism was. They do think that the presidency now has too much power. So will they, regardless of ideology, say that we need to dial back on some of the, unilateral decisions, the executive orders and all that kind of thing? Do you think people will be less supportive of that? Or is it just, we don't care, as long as it's our guy, we're still okay with it?
Well, in the first place, I think your point's very important, that people are going to tend to think, well, this is our guy, and so we're okay with what he does. And I wanted to point out in connection with that this book is not actually a partisan book. I noted that the zeros were Obama and Clinton and Carter and not Franklin Roosevelt, he got a 1, and Woodrow Wilson and so on. And people might think, oh, it's just the Democrats. But actually also among the lowest rated were George W. Bush, George H.W. Bush, and Herbert Hoover and Republicans. It should not be about, for anyone, whether it's our guy or their guy. It should be about, do they help Americans and do they observe the constitutional restraints? And there's no doubt that the executive power right now is way beyond what it ought to be. And Trump has taken advantage of that. At the same time, he has observed that. For example, in his response to COVID and respecting the governors and not mandating anything nationally, but letting the governors set the tone for their states. That is an eminently constitutional way to behave that Joe Biden has already announced that he's not going to observe when he has said that he's going to make everybody wear masks. So he has, in a certain sense, Trump, has set the ball rolling for a movement back to observance of the real restrictions in the Constitution. But whether or not that continues really depends on what happens over the next few years. We might not have any more free elections. And so we can just forget about any talk of reform.
Well, this has been a good hour talking about presidency and going into slight history on what people did and what they accomplished and what they didn't accomplish. I just think that there's a rift between those who think the president have too much power on the left and the right, and those who think give the president all the power he wants as long as he gives us what we want on the left and the right. So this is going to be an interesting battle to see who wins. And right now, ultimate power is winning. I think Trump may help in the sense that so many people don't like him and they're concerned about what he did, that they may say, we need to take some of that power back so the next guy can't do it. They're not ready to have that conversation now, though.